There are places on this planet where just being American could make you a target. Countries where U.S. flags are burned in the streets, where the mere mention of Washington sparks outrage, and where entire generations are raised to hate everything the United States stands for. From brutal state propaganda to explosive geopolitical rivalries, the hostility is real, and in some of these nations, it's only getting worse. Why do these countries despise America? Is it just about politics? Or is it something much deeper, a clash of cultures, economics, and power? This isn't your average travel warning. This is the global blacklist. Stay tuned, because you won't believe which country made it to number 1. Number 10. Turkey. Once seen as a bridge between East and West, Turkey has become one of the most unpredictable U.S. allies in the last decade. But in 2025, the situation has deteriorated even further. According to a 2023 Metropol survey, over 55% of Turkish citizens now hold unfavorable views of the United States, many citing foreign interference, hypocrisy, and imperialism as their main grievances. So what went wrong? It starts with geopolitics. Tensions over U.S. support for Kurdish militias in Syria have long infuriated Ankara, which views the Kurdish YPG as a terrorist threat. Add in disputes over Sweden's NATO accession, America's arms embargoes, and U.S. sanctions on Turkish officials, and suddenly, the partnership looks more like a powder keg. Then there's the economy. Turkey's GDP in 2023 was approximately $900 billion United States dollars, but staggering inflation, hovering around 40%, has crushed the middle class. And who do Turkish politicians blame? You guessed it, America. Nationalist rhetoric from President Erdogan's party routinely frames the U.S. as an economic saboteur manipulating Turkey's downfall from behind the scenes. Here's the real shocker. U.S. tourists are still flooding into Turkey, drawn by its beautiful coastlines and ancient ruins. But should they be worried? With anti-American sentiment surging and the political climate hardening, it might just be time to rethink that Istanbul getaway. Number 9. Belarus. Tucked between Poland and Russia, Belarus is often overshadowed in Western media. But don't underestimate it, because under the iron rule of Alexander Lukashenko, Belarus has become a hotbed of state-controlled anti-Americanism. In government-sponsored surveys, over 55% of Belarusians report negative views toward the United States. And that number is likely much higher among regime loyalists. Lukashenko, who has ruled Belarus since 1994, leans heavily on Russia for economic survival and political protection. In return, he parrots Moscow's talking points, which means painting America as a destabilizing force. U.S. support for Belarusian opposition groups and democracy movements has been twisted into a propaganda weapon, portrayed as Western meddling, aimed at regime change. Economically, Belarus isn't thriving. With a GDP around $60 billion United States dollars, the economy is tightly state-controlled and heavily sanctioned by the West. The government blames the US and EU for its stagnation, further fanning the flames of nationalism. And when dissent does break out, Lukashenko's police state cracks down with brutal force, accusing protesters of being American puppets. Why does this matter to you? Because Belarus isn't just aligned with Russia, it's a staging ground for anti-American ideology in Eastern Europe. If tensions explode in the region, this tiny country could play an outsized role. Number 8. Myanmar. Before the 2021 coup, Myanmar was on a path toward democratic reform, and even U.S. investment. Fast forward to 2025, and the country has become a breeding ground for anti-American sentiment. According to sparse but credible independent surveys, between 60 to 70% of respondents now view the U.S. unfavorably. Why? Because Washington condemned the military junta, and that didn't go unnoticed. After the Tatmadaw seized power, the U.S. hit Myanmar with sweeping sanctions. It froze assets, halted aid, and suspended diplomatic ties. But instead of collapsing, the regime doubled down. In speeches, state-run newspapers, and even school curricula, the U.S. is now painted as a foreign aggressor trying to destabilize Myanmar's sovereignty. Meanwhile, the economy has cratered. Myanmar's GDP was about $70 billion United States dollars before the coup, but now it's in freefall. Western companies have pulled out, foreign direct investment has dried up, and sanctions have throttled the banking sector. The junta's solution: blame America, and it's working. National pride is being weaponized against the West, particularly the U.S. American travelers, once welcomed for tourism and business, are now treated with suspicion, or worse. In some areas, travel is outright dangerous. Is Myanmar slipping into the arms of China or Russia? Or is it forging its own isolated path, powered by anger and resentment? Number 7. Yemen. War-torn, fractured, and desperate, Yemen is a country where anti-American sentiment isn't just political, it's visceral. According to multiple international organizations, 80 to 90% of Yemenis among those surveyed now harbor negative views toward the U.S., and in many cases, outright hatred. But this animosity didn't appear out of nowhere. The United States has long been involved in Yemen's civil war, whether through drone strikes, intelligence sharing with Saudi Arabia, or arms sales to coalition forces. For Yemenis living under bombs, displacement, and famine, the distinction between America and its allies is blurry at best. In their eyes, Washington has blood on its hands. Economically, Yemen is in freefall. Its GDP has collapsed into the low tens of billions, and inflation is beyond catastrophic, often in triple-digit territory. Food is scarce, medicine is rarer, and survival has become a daily battle. In this environment, U.S. foreign policy is seen not as neutral diplomacy, but as a weapon of war. Even humanitarian aid from the U.S. is met with suspicion. Some groups believe it's just a cover for spying or influence peddling. In this fractured nation, American passports don't bring safety, they bring danger. Number 6. Syria. Once viewed as a crossroads of ancient civilizations, Syria has become a battlefield of broken alliances and bitter enmity, especially toward the United States. Since the onset of the Syrian civil war in 2011, anti-American sentiment has exploded, fueled by years of military interventions, failed diplomatic promises, and power struggles that left the nation in ruins. State-run media in areas still controlled by Bashar al-Assad's regime routinely blames the U.S. for the nation's fragmentation. Independent reporting and informal polling suggest that 70 to 80% of pro-regime populations believe that America played a key role in destabilizing Syria, not just through military action but also by allegedly funding opposition groups. The economic wreckage adds fuel to the fire. Once considered a growing economy in the early 2000s, Syria's GDP has imploded, now estimated to be below 60 billion. With nearly 90% of the population living under the poverty line and inflation levels spiraling out of control, the crisis has left people desperate, and desperate populations are often fed easy scapegoats. And that's exactly what anti-American propaganda offers: a clear enemy to blame for power outages, food shortages, and the endless civil conflict that continues to scar the country. But it's not just rhetoric. The ongoing presence of U.S. forces in parts of northern Syria, especially around Kurdish territories, has made Syria a hotbed for accusations of occupation and resource theft. Local and regional leaders have condemned U.S. military operations as neo-colonial interference. Even those not aligned with the Assad regime often view America with skepticism or outright hostility. From the ruins of Aleppo to the contested oil fields of Deir ez-Zor, the American flag is more likely to inspire rage than relief. The real tragedy: Syrians once looked westward with hope for change. But a decade of drone strikes, shattered alliances, and broken trust has turned that hope into hatred. What could have been a chapter of American-led rebuilding is now seen as a prolonged saga of exploitation. The question now is chilling: has U.S. involvement done more harm than good? And Syria isn't the only war zone asking that question. Number 5. Cuba. For more than half a century, U.S. and Cuba relations have been defined by embargoes, invasions, and deep-seated mistrust. While diplomatic gestures under the Obama administration briefly thawed tensions, the Trump-era clampdowns and renewed travel restrictions reignited the old animosity. Today, anti-Americanism is more than a political talking point in Cuba, it's a national narrative. Government-aligned polls and local surveys suggest that as much as 85% of the Cuban population views U.S. policies unfavorably, if not outright hostile. That animosity is reinforced daily in state-run news outlets, which depict the U.S. as an ever-present threat to sovereignty. Economically, the numbers are brutal. Cuba's GDP is estimated at around $100 billion, but chronic shortages of food, medicine, and energy plague everyday life. U.S. sanctions, combined with internal mismanagement, have fueled decades of deprivation. While the government blames the U.S. for nearly every crisis, it's important to note that many Cubans buy into that narrative not out of blind loyalty, but because they live the consequences every day. When your baby doesn't have powdered milk and your elderly parents can't access insulin, it's easy to hate the country blamed for the blockade. But here's the kicker. Even younger generations, raised in a supposedly more connected, post-Cold War era, are not immune to this ideological hostility. In schools and universities, American culture is taught with heavy warnings. While underground hip-hop and bootleg Hollywood movies may circulate privately, public opinion remains deeply cautious, if not hostile. The fear of U.S. influence persists like a scar passed down from the Bay of Pigs to the blackouts of 2025. And just when you think Cuba might be softening, they double down. With ties to Russia and Venezuela tightening again, the island is positioning itself as a defiant symbol against U.S. hegemony. Could Cuba become the next proxy battleground? If the past is any guide, the embers of hatred won't be extinguished anytime soon. Number 4. Venezuela. No country in Latin America has weaponized anti-Americanism more ruthlessly than Venezuela. Under the socialist regimes of Hugo Chavez and now Nicolas Maduro, anti-U.S. rhetoric has become state religion. Government-controlled media outlets push daily propaganda blaming the United States for everything from inflation to blackouts to food shortages. A staggering 80% of state communications blame the U.S. for the country's collapse, and that's no exaggeration. According to recent NGO surveys, more than 70% of Venezuelans under Maduro's influence now associate American with enemy. And it's not just talk. The data backs up the devastation. Venezuela's GDP has plummeted to below $100 billion, making it one of the worst-performing economies in the Western Hemisphere. At its worst, hyperinflation reached over 1,000% annually, decimating purchasing power and livelihoods. In such conditions, the regime's survival depends on externalizing blame, and the U.S. is the go-to villain. From economic sanctions to alleged coup plots, America is painted as the puppet master behind Venezuela's misery. But it gets even darker. Maduro's government has made anti-American identity part of its national pride campaign. Students are taught about U.S. imperialism in classrooms, state-sponsored rallies chant against the White House, and propaganda posters depict American leaders as cartoon villains. The regime's message is clear. Poverty isn't their fault, it's yours. And that message sticks. In a broken society clinging to nationalism, America becomes a symbol of betrayal and threat. Yet here's the paradox. Even while many Venezuelans flee to the U.S. seeking safety and opportunity, a large portion of the population left behind sees America not as a savior, but a saboteur. How did it come to this? When despair becomes identity, anti-Americanism becomes a survival mechanism, and Venezuela has embraced it with a vengeance. Number 3. Russia. If there's a Cold War 2.0 happening in 2025, Russia is leading the charge, and anti-Americanism is its ideological weapon. Fueled by state media, nationalist fervor, and years of escalating tensions over NATO, Ukraine, and sanctions, public opinion in Russia has taken a hard turn. A 2023 Levada Center poll revealed that nearly 65% of Russians now harbor a negative view of the United States, a number that has climbed steadily since 2014. In a country where television remains the primary news source for much of the population, state-controlled broadcasters paint the U.S. as the architect of global chaos. The economic numbers deepen the divide. Russia's 2023 GDP stood at about $1.8 trillion United States dollars, but inflation surged near 15% due to ongoing sanctions and economic isolation. In this climate, the Kremlin uses America as a strategic scapegoat, a foreign villain blamed for every domestic hardship. Whether it's a currency devaluation or rising food prices, the official message is the same: blame the West. And most of all, blame the United States. But the propaganda goes deeper than economics. Russian identity is being recast in direct opposition to American values. Putin's speeches often frame Russia as the last bulwark against Western moral decay, rejecting liberalism, LGBTQ+ rights, and free speech as American poison. This ideological war isn't subtle. It's front and center in schools, military briefings, and primetime broadcasts. The narrative is simple: the U.S. wants to destroy Russia from within. What's truly alarming is how this attitude spills into foreign policy. From alliances with Iran and China to cyberwarfare and proxy conflicts, Russia's hostility toward the U.S. is no longer just verbal, it's tactical. Are we witnessing the rebirth of a global standoff? With nuclear arsenals and digital warfare now on the table, the stakes are far higher than during the First Cold War. And the hatred, it runs deeper than ever. Number 2, Iran. Iran's disdain for the United States isn't just political, it's deeply cultural, historical, and personal. From the 1953 CIA-backed coup to the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the Iranian public has been bombarded with a steady diet of anti-American sentiment for generations. And it's not just history books, it's banners, sermons, and state-sponsored parades. A 2023 Pew Research Center survey showed that a shocking 75% of Iranians hold an unfavorable view of the United States, driven by decades of conflict, sanctions, and religious doctrine. The economic pain is real, and many blame Washington. With a GDP of around $231 billion United States dollars and inflation frequently topping 40%, everyday Iranians are crushed by sky-high prices and limited access to global markets. While some Iranians criticize their own leaders, the regime's messaging, that America is the root of all suffering, resonates more strongly each time a medicine shipment gets delayed or a bank account gets frozen. Anti-Americanism becomes not just a narrative, but a lived experience. But what's especially potent is the way this animosity is institutionalized. In Iran, chanting, "Death to America," isn't extremist, it's routine. From the country's supreme leader to its schoolteachers, the message is clear: the United States is the enemy of Islam, of justice, of the Iranian people. American flags are burned in public. Schoolchildren are taught that U.S. influence must be resisted at every turn. And these aren't empty gestures, they reflect a deep, ideological hostility that spans generations. And here's the terrifying twist: the hate runs both ways. With tensions rising over nuclear ambitions and proxy wars in the Middle East, Iran and the U.S. are teetering on the edge of direct conflict. Is a military showdown inevitable? If it happens, make no mistake, the hatred already runs so deep, the fuse may only need one spark. Number 1, North Korea. Topping the list is a nation where anti-American hatred isn't just propaganda, it's state doctrine: North Korea. For over 70 years, the regime has demonized the United States with almost religious intensity. From kindergarten classrooms to military parades, the American flag is a symbol of evil, destruction, and imperialism. A 2024 Defector interview published by Radio Free Asia revealed that children are taught to stab effigies of Americans in mock combat drills by the age of 6. This isn't just hostility, it's indoctrinated hatred. The numbers are staggering. While reliable public polling is impossible in such a tightly controlled society, state-run broadcasts and defectors, testimonies suggest that nearly 100% of the population has been conditioned to distrust, fear, and despise the United States. Posters in Pyongyang depict American soldiers slaughtering Korean families, and every national crisis, from blackouts to food shortages, is blamed on U.S. hostility. The infamous Songun policy, or military first, is built around defending the nation from what the regime describes as an imminent American invasion. Economically, North Korea is a failed state propped up by China and illicit trade. Its GDP is estimated to be below $30 billion, with millions living in extreme poverty and chronic malnutrition. Yet instead of blaming the regime's isolationist policies, the average North Korean, raised on a steady diet of anti-American paranoia, sees the US as the reason they suffer. State media reinforces this daily with stories of heroic resistance against imagined American threats. And with nuclear weapons as their bargaining chip, the Kim dynasty has tied its very survival to opposing US dominance. But what makes North Korea's hatred so dangerous is how it fuels real geopolitical threats. From nuclear missile tests to cyberattacks on US infrastructure, Pyongyang has made its hatred kinetic. It's not just ideology, it's a foreign policy doctrine built on defiance. So, what happens if the world finally calls Kim Jong-un's bluff? With nukes, cyber weapons, and deep-rooted rage, the answer could shake the globe. There it is, 10 countries where hatred for America isn't just common, it's the default. And it didn't happen overnight. From decades of foreign interventions to economic sanctions, from drone strikes to diplomatic hypocrisy, the seeds of anti-Americanism have been sown, and in 2025, they've sprouted into full-blown resistance. These aren't just unfriendly neighbors. They're nuclear powers, economic saboteurs, and ideological enemies who see the US not as a global leader, but as a global threat. The result: a world quietly rearming, regrouping, and resisting, while Washington underestimates just how deeply the resentment runs. So ask yourself, are we heading into another Cold War? Or something far worse, a world united by one common enemy, America? Because here's the shocking truth. In 2025, the most powerful nation on Earth may also be the most hated. And that should terrify us all.